Hello folks, Alex here. This is Alex Unabridged, and today it's time to talk about some of those spicy books. This is Al's tasteful guide to vintage smut. So welcome back to the channel if that is the case. Yes, this is another one of my little GarbAugust prep videos, and today I'm going to be focusing on one of the themes for GarbAugust, a theme from week 2, which is of course vintage smut. Some of my fellow co-hosts and I have volunteered to do little guides, little videos on particular themes. And I said I would do the vintage smut one. So warning up front, this will obviously cover adult themes, so this video is not suitable for younger viewers. So if you've got kids, obviously I'm sure you've already got them out of the room if you've seen the title to this video and clicked on it. But yes, smut interests me for a number of reasons. One, it's fun and can be very funny. But it's also about, like, it's interesting looking at it from a vintage perspective, and certainly looking back at different eras, because you can see how the language and the attitudes to sex and sexuality and things like that change over time. It's interesting in terms of like how things have shifted in terms of what was once taboo, which now isn't so taboo, and you know what sort of remains as taboo. And I think a big one for me as well is about representation. You know, it's you know, particularly for LGBT stuff in my case, reading stuff that fits into the smut category in my late teens, early 20s, that explored that kind of physical side of queer sexuality and queer identity, gender identity, was actually quite liberating, and it taught me that my own sexuality wasn't something to be ashamed of. So there are, you know, multitudinous reasons for reading and enjoying smut, and that's a big thing to note. There is absolutely no shame in reading and enjoying smutty books, or books with a smutty element to them. In the same way that there is absolutely no shame in reading and enjoying, you know, gory horror. I do that as well. Or reading, you know, kind of darker stuff or more violent action and adventure things like that. We are all adults here. We can all make our own choices. And as I say, that, you know, with certain things there is an element of liberation to it. You might read something looking for a bit of fun smuttiness, but actually find more in it, and I have done that in the past. So, to define vintage and smut then, to start with, vintage, let's start with that one. There was much discussion amongst fellow co-hosts when I asked the question of how old does something have to be considered vintage. There were also a few existential crises triggered as we discussed it. But I'm going to go with the definition that's kind of cropped up in that discussion, and also that I keep coming up, that keeps popping up when I look online, and that is that basically anything that is sort of 25 years old and older. Sometimes I see as little as 20 years, but I'm going to go with the 25. That seems to be the most common. And so between 25 years and 100 years can be considered vintage. Beyond 100 years, you are getting into the antique. So for books wise, that would mean that the publication year of something being like 1998 thereabouts is kind of the sort of the closest to our current time that you could potentially think of as vintage, and of course then goes back to like 1923. So the smut definition. The way I personally would define smut in terms of literature is something that is sexually explicit, something that probably where sex or sexuality is often, although not always, a focal point of the work. So it might be that the plot itself takes a back seat generally, and the plot is used more as a device to get you, the reader, from like sex scene to sex scene. Or it might be where the plot is very much centered on the physical as well as the emotional elements of a relationship. You know, it's kind of, you can have, I think, romance. There's some romance which is very much romance, and it's about the relationship, the emotional relationship and how you navigate that. And then there's sort of the spicier romances where there's a lot more focus on the sexual side as well as the emotional side. I think something else that I look for is the tone of the language that's used with regards to the sex. It's kind of a hard thing to describe without examples, and I'm not about to read a load of smutty passages out for this video. I told you this is a tasteful guide, but I think there's often a tone to the language that makes it something feel smuttier. That's all I can say, and I think that's kind of that leads me to the next thing, which is I think smut is kind of subjective in terms of its definition, in that, like, and I'll bastardize a well-known saying here, but smut is in the eye of the beholder. A note on pornography here. I would define pornography's objective as being graphic depiction of sexually explicit scenes for the express purpose of sexual desire or arousal, stimulating sexual desire or arousal. I think pornography could be described as smut, but I don't think that all smut can be described as pornography. Far from it. But that is how I personally think of smut, how I define smut. But as I say, your mileage may vary. It's a wide open thing, basically. So let's have a look at some examples then of what I think of as vintage smut, what I think could be considered vintage smut, and look at a few different books in terms of the types of books, the genres of books, and also kind of a few through time, a little historical tour of some spicy texts. So let's start the closest to our current time. This is one that I have read before, which is also on my wish list, my pile of possibilities for GarbAugust, because I haven't read it since I was about 19. And this is Big Deal by Helen Sandler, and this is part of the Sapphire collection of lesbian erotic fiction. There were several of these books. I have read several of them. These were published in the 90s, and they are very, very 90s, I think, or from what I remember. So I would put these in the vintage smut category. These are quite explicit from what I remember, but I don't remember a huge amount. It was a long time ago. So I'm quite interested to dive back in and see what I make of this these days. I don't remember being that impressed with it at the time, other than the fact it was like, whoa, okay. I kind of didn't necessarily expect what I got. So that's one example from the 90s. Another example from the 90s is something I've only ever kind of I've seen about quite a bit, and it's something that has kind of always intrigued me a little, and that's the work of Nicholson Baker, who wrote a couple of books in the 90s. You know, sort of erotic literary fiction, I think is kind of how you describe it. One of which is Vox, which is told through the voices of two strangers who meet on a private telephone chat line. And then there's Fermata as well, which is about a man who can stop time and uses this ability to embark on a series of sexual adventures, and that was published in 94. So there we've got, you know, something very different. This is something that was, you know, praised by critics and other kind of literary fiction authors themselves, like Vox. I remember seeing on the back cover like a quote from Faye Weldon. You know, there was quotes from, you know, positive quotes from critics from mainstream newspapers, etc. So, you know, it was received well in the literary world, but by all accounts, it is a work of erotic fiction. Those are a couple of potentials if you're looking at something a little more literary. Okay, 1980s, we've got some erotica, and this is Macho Sluts, which I read probably back in the early 2000s. This is from 1988, and it's by Pat Califia. Pat Califia is now Patrick Califia, he's a trans man, but back then was lesbian identified, and Califia had written the stories between 1977 and 1988, the short stories, during the period of quite a fierce struggle between lesbian feminist SM practitioners and anti-pornography feminists. So although this is, and it is, you know, spicy, and you know it does deal with kink as well. It's, you know, again, it's like it was quite an important text in terms of politically speaking. It's kind of an activist response. It's been called, you know, by scholars, an activist response to this to the sort of anti-pornography feminism in the 70s. And it explores, you know, lots of different fantasy concepts and it includes lesbians, gay men, and those of indeterminate sexuality and gender. So yeah, although it's it's quite spicy, it's good, but it's got something else to it there. It's got another layer to it, or several other layers to it. Okay, back into the 1980s then. And one that I will be reading for GarbAugust by an author who is known for this kind of smutty romance. And that, of course, is Jilly Cooper. And I will be reading Riders, which is set against the backdrop of the English Cotswolds countryside. I think it's in a fictional county called Rutshire, appropriately named. And it follows the fortunes of a group of fame and money-hungry show-jumping stars, and yes, by all accounts, it's listed as a romance on various booksellers when I look it up. But yes, I think it's, you know, I think potentially the tone of it, and you only have to look at the front cover to kind of sort of think, yeah, it's probably going to be quite smutty. So yeah, so that's one. And of course, the other name that you cannot escape when you're talking about the 70s, 80s, is, and beyond, to be fair, is Jackie Collins, of course, who wrote something like, say, Sinners from 1971, which is, you know, Hollywood, glittering premieres, movie sets, parties, love nests, all kind of in sort of Malibu and Beverly Hills, and explores kind of the exploits of its characters. You know, it says, behind the gorgeous playgrounds of the rich and renowned lies a jungle of lust and perversity, greed and ambition, love and danger, where survival is all and innocence is a role nobody plays for long. Yeah, so Jackie Collins is another author known for this kind of romance slash, you know, kind of quite sort of over the top, quite sensational kind of stories and characters and stuff like that. Sounds like great fun. I will also be reading some Jackie Collins, hopefully, for this GarbAugust. The next two are two that I found on a wonderful blog that I came across during my research for GarbAugust in general. There's a couple of great trash literature blogs out there. And this one is Glorious Trash. I will link to it in the description. And from 1974, The Illusionist #1, The Most Happy Con Man by John P. Radford. And to look at this, the description of it, etc., you'd kind of assume that it was some sort of kind of lighter sort of sex comedy, capers type thing. But according to the author of the blog, nope, it is not this, it is sleaze. And I think sleaze is one of those, I would use the word sleaze as quite a negative connotation. It's not the kind of fun smut or the sexy smut. It's not nice. If you're intrigued, I would recommend to go and read the blog author's review of both The Illusionist 1 and 2. and because yeah, some of the excerpts that he talks about in there are thoroughly unpleasant. So that is not the sort of thing that I personally would go for. But yes, it exists if you are interested. The link is in the description. Another one mentioned on Glorious Trash blog is Sexual Strike Force from 1972. Now this sounds a lot more fun. This apparently comes off like a parody of the men's adventure novels, which were popular at the time, of course. But rather than endless gun battles, it's composed of endless sex scenes, says the author of the blog. So that one, I think, that was the sort of thing where I'd much more likely give it a go, because that sounds like it could be quite amusing. Okay, into the 60s, and the first of a couple of French erotica. So the first one is Emmanuel by Emmanuel Alsan. Originally published in French in 1967, but translated into English in 1971, which is a series of explicit fantasies of the author, in which she basically has liaisons with several often anonymous men and women, as well as her husband. It's written in the first person, and the reader sees the events entirely through the eyes of our sexually adventurous heroine, Emmanuel. I saw the film of this, the 1974 film, I think it is, 75 film, of this in my teens. I think it was on late one night, and I happened to be up, and I watched it, and it was an education, shall we say. I can't have been much more than about 15, something like that, I think, when I saw it, 15, 16. Yes, it was educational. And I read the book later on, probably I think it was early 20s or something like that. I don't remember it being too bad. It was of its time, I think. Okay, staying in the 60s and into the 70s and into the 80s, so something written across that kind of decade to 15 years. And another one which I think is actually, you know, a really important text or work, I should say, is the comics by Tom of Finland, the Kake comics, I think it's pronounced, Kake. And this is explicit, but of course it's well known these days. I think it's a really important queer work. I came to it because I was kind of like, whoa, what's this? But then again, through kind of reading it and also reading the cultural context of it, when it was written, why it was written, etc., and the influence that it's had, I think, yeah, there's more to it than just the erotic comic. Okay, back into the 1950s, we've got another French erotic novel, The Story of O, from 1954, and I have got this on my GarbAugust pile of possibilities as well. This is about a beautiful young French woman known only as O, who is taken by her lover René to a splendid mansion near Paris, and here she's initiated into an elite secret society where she must learn to serve the sexual fantasies of René and his fellow members. It actually won a French literature prize, the what's it called, the Prix de Deux Margot. My French pronunciation is probably terrible, so I apologise. In 1955, but the French authorities still brought an obscenity charge against it, which didn't stick, but it was still banned from any kind of publicity for quite a while after that. But yeah, the fact it won a literature prize. The author has stated that she wrote the novel for her lover, who had admired the work of the Marquis de Sade. So I'm guessing by that it's probably quite extreme, and from what I've read about it, it's probably reasonably extreme. And I'm a little nervous of reading that one, I have to say, because of that reference to the Marquis de Sade. A note on the Marquis de Sade, whilst I've mentioned his name, that could, of course, be included in the smut category. Certainly 120 Days of Sodom could be. We're getting into the antique, definitely into the antique, in fact. because that was written in 1785, not published until 1904, but written back in the 18th century. I read this when I was at university. There wasn't really, have to say, anything remotely enjoyable about the read. It was an interesting exercise in terms of literary history and history in terms of the Marquis de Sade. But yeah, it's extreme. It's extreme. So I wouldn't recommend it as a necessarily recommend it as a trashy read for GarbAugust. Olly has read it as part of his Disturbing Books series. So if you're interested, I will link to his video on the 120 Days of Sodom. Then back into the 20s and sort of the 30s, we've got a classic of literature, and certainly erotic literature and controversial literature, and that is, of course, Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence, which was first published privately in the 20s, and then the first authorised publication, I think, was in 32, but then, of course, there was like a lot of bannings of it. So yeah, an absolute, I think, classic of, sort of, certainly erotic literature, romance literature, but certainly one that even today still kind of, ruffles feathers somewhat. But yes, I that was one where it was on, I think, my mum's shelves, and I read it because I wanted to know what all the fuss was about. So yes, so that's one from the 20s. And then finally, we'll go back into the antique with some Victorian erotica. And there's a lot of this that is published anonymously. Evelyn is the one that I will hopefully be reading for GarbAugust. And this is a woman's perspective, which I guess was probably a rare thing for the time, on sexual liberation, as our heroine Evelyn embarks on a grand voyage of the male and female physique, savouring all from stable boy to sailor to lord and lady. It is, by all accounts, a gem of Victorian erotica, and it was written in 1840. As I say, it's anonymously written. So we'll see what those naughty Victorians have got for us in that. So yes, so that's kind of a little sort of potted history and some ideas of various different things that you could read for the vintage smut category. So yeah, you've got your pick of spicier romances, through to sort of sex comedies, through erotica and beyond. It is entirely up to you what floats your boat, basically. Do let me know in the comments if you're going to do something from if you're going to read something from the vintage smut theme for week 2. Let me know what you've got on your TBR. But yes, thank you very much for watching today, folks. If you enjoyed this video, please do consider giving me a like and subscribing for more content coming very soon. But from me, for now, stay trashy.